The champagne glasses were still half full when James, Marcus's best man, burst into the bridal suite. His face was ashen, "I ask you," and he was clutching his phone like a lifeline. "Sarah, he started, then stopped, running his hands through his already disheveled hair. The room fell silent, the celebratory atmosphere evaporating instantly. Sarah's phone buzzed in her lap. Time seemed to slow as she read the message. "I can't do this. I'm sorry." 6 words from Marcus. Just 6 words to demolish 3 years of love and trust. Her fingers trembled as she tried calling him, once, twice, 3 times. Each attempt went straight to voicemail, his familiar greeting becoming a cruel reminder of what was slipping away. He was acting strange this morning, James admitted, his voice cracking. He kept checking his phone, saying he needed air. "I thought it was just normal wedding jitters." He described finding the groom's room empty. Marcus's perfectly pressed tuxedo crumpled on the floor like discarded dreams. In the parking lot, fresh tire marks told the story of his hasty departure. The wedding coordinator, Marion, appeared in the doorway, her professional composure slipping. "The guests are getting restless," she whispered to Lisa. "What should I tell them?" 200 people sat in the chapel, surrounded by the cherry blossoms Sarah had specifically chosen to surprise Marcus, a reminder of their time in Japan. Sarah stood slowly, her grandmother's veil suddenly feeling heavy as lead. The $5,000 dress, with its hand-stitched pearls and vintage lace, now felt like an elaborate costume in a cruel play. Her mother reached for her, but Sarah stepped back, needing space as the reality crashed over her in waves. "I should have known," she whispered, remembering signs she'd dismissed, his recent distraction, late-night phone calls he'd take outside, the way he'd hesitated when discussing their honeymoon plans. The first edition book he'd sent earlier now sat on the vanity, its romantic message mocking her. Lisa took charge, her maid of honor instincts kicking in. "James, find his parents. Mrs. Chen, please help me with the guests. Someone needs to stop the string quartet." But Sarah barely heard them. She was staring at her reflection again, just as she had an hour ago. Same mirror, same dress, same woman, but everything had changed. In the chapel below, the murmuring grew louder as the scheduled ceremony time came and went, the perfect spring day continuing indifferently outside, while Sarah's world collapsed within. Sarah hadn't expected her private heartbreak to become public property. The story spread like wildfire through Boston's publishing circles. Rising star editor left at altar, making headlines in the local lifestyle sections. Her position at Maxwell Publishing made her noteworthy enough for the story to gain traction, and soon her Instagram was flooded with messages from strangers, some offering sympathy, others thinly veiled judgment, and a few even suggesting she dodged a bullet. The Marcus sightings began 3 days after the wedding. A college friend spotted him at a Seattle coffee shop, head down over his laptop. Another saw him boarding a bus in Portland. Each well-meaning message tracked his escape route up the coast, like some twisted reality show. Each ping on her phone reopening wounds that hadn't begun to heal. His credit card was cancelled, his phone disconnected, his social media wiped clean, as if Marcus Rodriguez had simply ceased to exist. At work, Sarah threw herself into manuscript deadlines with a fervor that concerned her colleagues. She edited through lunch breaks, stayed late into the evening, and volunteered for every overflow project. The manuscripts blurred together. Romance novels became particularly painful to edit, their happy endings feeling like personal attacks. Her boss, Caroline, watched with growing concern as Sarah's normally incisive editorial comments became mechanical, lacking their usual insight. The breaking point came on a Tuesday 6 weeks after the non-wedding. During her lunch break, Sarah found herself inexplicably wandering into Nordstrom's bridal section. Standing among the white dresses, she caught her reflection in a mirror, dark circles under her eyes, unwashed hair hastily pulled back, yesterday's clothes slightly rumpled. The sight of a young bride-to-be toiling in front of her mother triggered something deep inside. Sarah collapsed onto a nearby ottoman, shocking nearby shoppers with uncontrollable sobs. Sarah Chen stared at her reflection in the antique mirror, her grandmother's lace veil catching the morning light and casting delicate shadows across her face. The bridal suite of the historic Wellington Hotel buzzed with activity. Bridesmaids in silk robes arranging fresh flowers, her mother carefully steaming the cathedral-length train, and her best friend Lisa meticulously arranging the cherry blossom hairpins that would secure her veil. The date, April 15th, hadn't been chosen by accident. It was the same day her parents had married 30 years ago, and the cherry blossoms that decorated the chapel were in full bloom, just as they had been in Tokyo when Marcus first kissed her beneath their falling petals. She smiled, remembering how he planned that entire trip around the cherry blossom forecast, determined to create the perfect moment. "Your father would have loved him," her mother said softly, catching Sarah's eye in the mirror as she adjusted the veil. Sarah's hand instinctively went to the vintage locket around her neck, her something old, containing a faded photo of her father from his last good day before cancer took him. The small diamond on its clasp caught the light, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. 3 years of dating had led to this moment, starting with their meet-cute in that cramped bookstore cafe where they'd both reached for the last copy of Love in the Time of Cholera. Marcus had insisted she take it, only to show up at her publishing office the next day with another copy and an invitation to discuss it over dinner. His proposal, 8 months ago, had been in that same bookstore, with ring hidden inside a hollowed-out book he'd specially crafted. The architect in him couldn't resist creating something unique. A knock at the door broke through her reverie. Lisa opened it to accept delivery of a small package, wrapped in cream-colored paper with gold trim. "It's from Marcus," she announced, handing it to Sarah. Inside, she found a first edition of their favorite book and a handwritten note. "To my future wife, here's to writing our own love story, one page at a time. See you at the altar." Sarah's mother appeared with a bottle of champagne, her eyes glistening. "A toast," she declared, as Lisa quickly gathered the bridesmaids. "To new beginnings, lasting love, and the kind of happiness your father and I shared." The sound of glasses clinking mingled with laughter and happy tears, while outside, guests began arriving at the chapel, unaware that this perfect morning was about to take an unexpected turn. That evening, she finally called the number Lisa had given her weeks ago. Dr. Matthews's warm voice answered, and for the first time, Sarah admitted she wasn't coping. The therapist's first question caught her off guard. "When was the last time you did something just for yourself, Sarah? Something that had nothing to do with work or Marcus?" The long silence that followed was answer enough. That night, Sarah canceled her upcoming editing assignments and emailed Caroline requesting a leave of absence. It was time to face what she'd been trying so hard to edit away. 2 years after the wedding that wasn't, Sarah sat in her newly purchased condo's home office, adjusting her microphone for her weekly podcast, turning the page. What had started as a therapeutic blog about rebuilding life after trauma had evolved into one of the top-rated personal growth podcasts in the country. Today's guest was a relationship therapist discussing the psychology of abandonment, and Sarah could finally talk about her own experience without her voice shaking. Her promotion to senior editor at Maxwell Publishing had come with an unexpected twist. She'd created a new imprint focusing on mental health and personal development. The manuscripts that once triggered her pain now fueled her purpose. Her own book deal was in the works, though she kept that quiet for now, testing the words in private like delicate seedlings not ready for harsh light. The book club she joined during her darkest days had transformed too. What began as 5 women sharing wine and war stories in her living room had grown into a monthly gathering of 20, then 30, then had to be moved to a local community center to accommodate the growing numbers. They called themselves the Phoenix Circle, and while they still discussed books, the real magic happened in the stories they shared about rising from their own ashes. Dating had been a deliberate choice, not a desperate search for replacement happiness. There was David, the literature professor who shared her love of obscure poetry but needed constant validation. Michael, the startup CEO whose ambition matched hers, but whose emotional availability didn't. The most promising had been Thomas, a corporate lawyer who seemed perfect on paper, until he proposed after 6 months, sending Sarah into a panic attack that revealed she wasn't as healed as she thought. The night she turned down Thomas's proposal, Sarah took herself on a date. She dressed up, booked a table for one at an upscale restaurant, and ordered champagne. The waitress asked if she was celebrating something. "Yes," Sarah replied. "I'm celebrating choosing myself." That evening, she adopted a rescue dog from the local shelter, a three-legged German shepherd who'd been abandoned on the highway. She named him Phoenix, and together they began exploring the city's hiking trails every weekend. Her Instagram, once a source of painful memories, now told a different story. There she was speaking at a women's leadership conference, teaching a workshop on narrative therapy, exploring Morocco's blue city alone. Phoenix's happy face appearing in photos from mountain summits and beach sunrises. Her mother had stopped asking when she'd get back out there and started asking about her next adventure instead. The email arrived during a pitch meeting. Sarah nearly dropped her phone when she saw the sender, Marcus Rodriguez. Subject line: "I know I don't deserve your time." He wrote about his diagnosis of severe panic disorder, the childhood memories of finding his father after a suicide attempt, his mother's string of toxic marriages. He'd spent 2 years in intensive therapy in Vancouver, where he'd fled after the wedding. The email included a link to a private blog documenting his mental health journey and a TED talk he'd given about mental health stigma in Latino communities. He ended with, "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that you never deserved what I did." They met at Caffeine and Pages, where they'd had their first date. Sarah arrived early, watching through the window as Marcus approached. He'd lost weight, his designer clothes replaced by worn jeans and a simple sweater. His hands shook as he stirred his coffee, describing his work counseling other men with anxiety disorders. "I see my younger self in them," he admitted, running from happiness because they don't believe they deserve it. Sarah noticed the therapy workbooks in his bag, the medication reminder on his phone, the grounding techniques he used when his voice trembled. This wasn't the man who'd left her. This was someone entirely new. Sarah's inner circle split over Marcus's return. Her mother threatened to disown her for even considering forgiveness. Her podcast listeners sent hundreds of messages sharing similar stories, some cautionary, others hopeful. Her therapist observed that Sarah's hesitation wasn't about trust, but about identity. "You've built a life as the woman who survived abandonment. Are you ready to be something else?" Marcus gave her space, sending only occasional updates about his therapy progress and his work with mental health organizations. One night, sorting through old wedding mementos she'd finally pulled from storage, Sarah realized she was no longer angry, just curious about who they both could become. Their fresh start began unexpectedly, volunteering together at a mental health crisis center. Sarah brought Phoenix, now a certified therapy dog, and Marcus helped train him to comfort patients. They built a friendship first, navigating triggers and boundaries with professional help. When romance eventually rekindled, it was different. Slower, more conscious, with regular therapy check-ins and open discussions about fears. A year later, Sarah featured their story on her podcast, titled "The Space Between Running Away and Coming Back." They didn't label their relationship or make promises about the future. Instead, they focused on each moment, knowing that sometimes the bravest love stories aren't about perfect endings, but about people choosing to grow together after growing apart.